If you keep it to a certain amount of time, like this tour is going to be a month, and that's really enough. And because if you're with people that you're having a good time with, it's fine.
She sang with the voice of an angel, but behind the sweetness was heartbreak wrapped in silence. Karen Carpenter lived with wounds too private for stage lights, too deep for applause to heal. Now, through whispers and remnants of her truth, 5 names surface. Musicians she quietly loathed, not for rivalry, but for pain. For the moments they made her feel invisible, mocked, or unworthy. These weren't feuds, these were quiet tragedies, etched into a voice that never stopped aching. The first figure to fracture her peace was Don Henley. Karen had crossed paths with Henley in the gilded but treacherous world of LA's social circles, where smiles were rehearsed and egos arrived before names. To her, Henley embodied everything cold and cruel about that world, arrogant, smug, and dismissive of anything soft. He didn't see beauty and vulnerability. He saw weakness. One night, surrounded by industry giants and champagne chatter, he let loose a biting remark. He allegedly joked that the Carpenter's success came from housewife hormones, a smug punchline that landed like a slap. Karen laughed softly to mask the sting, but the pain was instant and brutal. She left early that night, tears burning behind her eyes, questioning not only her music, but her worth. From that moment on, his name was never spoken with warmth again. Because for Karen, that moment didn't just bruise her, it confirmed her deepest fear, that no matter how pure her voice, how honest her songs, there would always be those who sneered at softness, who saw her heart not as art, but as a flaw. Worse yet was the cold precision of Frank Zappa. He didn't scream or insult, he smirked. Zappa's disdain came not in shouts, but in razor-sharp sarcasm that left Karen feeling small in the eyes of an industry she so desperately wanted to belong to. He mocked her clean-cut image, her gentle harmonies, as if honesty and vulnerability were crimes against music. He never said her name with malice, but never with respect either. To Karen, that quiet mockery felt crueler than any direct blow. It was the kind of cruelty that didn't bruise the skin but bruised the soul. She poured her pain into every note, and Zappa reduced it to a punchline. His brand of cool stood in stark, icy contrast to everything Karen was: warmth, emotion, purity. And that contrast stung more deeply than hate ever could. It erased her. Then came the betrayal that truly shook her: Dennis Wilson. From the outside, it looked like a romance born from stardust. Karen, soft and searching, Dennis, wild and magnetic. They were opposites that made sense, until they didn't. Their bond was fragile, tender at its core, but constantly pulled apart by Dennis's storms. One day he was affectionate, the next unreachable. He flirted with destruction like it was a game, dragging Karen into his chaos without warning or apology. She adored his broken charm. His unpredictability felt like the edge of something real. But real turned reckless.
Straight and steady for 8.5 years, and we decided to take a vacation. And then for the last year and a half, we've been working on the new album, Made in America.
His spirals into drugs, his sudden silences, the careless way he withdrew affection. It was a heartbreak wrapped in slow-motion confusion. She clung to hope, tried to fix him, to soothe him, even as it unraveled her. When he vanished emotionally, lost in his own addictions and ghosts, Karen was left staring at a silence that screamed louder than any fight. She felt discarded, erased, like even her deepest love wasn't enough to hold someone steady. It wasn't just the loss of love, it was the collapse of belief. Another door slammed, another voice in her head whispering she wasn't worthy, that her kindness only ever ended in abandonment. And in that ache, Dennis became a name she could no longer speak without trembling. The next sting came from someone she had once admired: Johnny Rotten. At the height of the punk explosion, Karen's soft melodies and polished presence stood in stark contrast to the chaos and fury that Rotten championed. To him, she embodied everything punk sought to destroy: order, vulnerability, delicacy. But he didn't just critique her art, he declared war on her essence. In interviews, he mocked her voice as manufactured, her music as hollow and meaningless. He called her sound a lie. Karen, who had built her career on honesty and emotional truth, was shattered. These weren't just words, they were a dismantling of her identity. Every insult echoed louder than the applause she'd ever received. She had believed that sincerity was strength, that the tremble in a voice could hold more power than the loudest scream. But Rotten turned her sincerity into weakness, her music into a joke. It was like watching everything she had loved about music, the vulnerability, the intimacy, be trampled under boots and spit. While Rotten roared on stage, ripping into the industry like a beast unchained, Karen sat alone under dim studio lights, pouring the weight of her soul into fragile harmonies. She didn't wear rebellion as a costume. Her rebellion was quiet, internal, made of tears she never let fall in public. And now, someone who had never felt the sting of gentle sorrow was sneering at her as if her existence were a fraud. The cruelty cut deep, not because of volume, but because of precision. It told her she wasn't enough for the new world of music, that her truth didn't matter, that being soft in a time of noise made you disposable. And for Karen, that realization didn't just hurt, it haunted. It rewrote how she heard her own songs, and it made her silence feel even heavier than before. And finally, the wound that remained carved into her confidence: Elvis Costello. By the late 70s, Karen was already battling shadows that clung to her like smoke, her frail health, the media's unforgiving lens, the relentless war with her reflection. Each day was a quiet struggle. Her voice, though angelic, had become both her weapon and her shield. And then came Elvis. In a single interview, he struck. With smirking cruelty, he dismissed her and Richard's music as lame, syrupy crap. To some, it was just a jab. But to Karen, it wasn't about genre or taste. It was about worth. It was about being seen as a joke after giving so much of herself to every note, every line, every harmony. She had sung through pain, written through loneliness, performed through exhaustion. Her music was her sanctuary. And now that sanctuary had been laughed at, mocked on a public stage by a man whose voice carried weight. He didn't just criticize, he humiliated. Karen didn't respond. She never clapped back or made headlines with rebuttals. That wasn't her. She internalized, and in that quiet acceptance, the wound festered. She took it to the studio, to the stage, to bed at night. It echoed in her faltering breath, in the uncertainty that began to creep into her once unwavering tone. She still sang. She always sang. But something inside her changed. The light dimmed. Costello's words didn't just injure. They confirmed what she secretly feared, that her softness would never be enough for the world she tried so hard to belong to, that her purity, her truth, her vulnerability were just targets for sharper tongues. To the world, her voice soared, but in her heart it trembled. A melody haunted by judgment, and no amount of applause could drown out the sting of being ridiculed by someone whose approval she never sought, but whose cruelty marked her all the same. Karen Carpenter never screamed, never lashed out. Her sorrow didn't roar, it sang, cloaked in lullabies and aching harmonies. Her heartbreak became a soundtrack for a generation, but no one heard the cries between the notes. Behind every soft phrase was a war she waged alone, against ridicule, against erasure, against the hollowness left by people who once smiled, then cut her to the bone. These weren't fleeting showbiz dramas or petty slights. These were emotional fractures, soul-deep bruises from voices that told her she didn't belong, that her purity was weakness, her vulnerability a target. Each name was a scar carved into her trust, her self-worth, her very identity, and yet she sang. In studios lit by loneliness, on stages crowded with applause that never reached her heart. She never threw insults, she never got even. But the silence she carried was louder than vengeance. because while the world bathed her in praise, behind the curtain she unraveled, fragile, doubting, aching. She didn't hate often, but when she did, it came from a depth the world never dared to look into. Not rage, sorrow. A sorrow so deep it hummed beneath every melody. Some wounds don't scream. Some wounds, like her voice, haunt quietly, and they never fade. They echo forever.